This week, Nevada lawmakers are hearing new bills aimed at curbing gun violence. But for decades, progress on this issue has been unraveled slowly by the gun lobby, both in Washington, D.C. and in states across the country. So today, we try to answer the question, have corporations hijacked the gun debate forever? From Battle Born Progress, this is Battle Born Bytes. My name is Jacob. Let's go. So today's episode is a little unusual for Battle Born Bytes because it's a little bit of a heavier topic than normal. But it's an important one. And like I said earlier, this week Nevada lawmakers are debating a set of new gun violence prevention bills. With that in mind, we wanted to take a look not only at the kinds of policies that can prevent this kind of violence, but also take a look at how we got here and sort of why things are the way they are. And to answer that question, there's really no other place to start than with the NRA. Oh yeah, National Rifle Association, let's go. So the National Rifle Association actually goes all the way back to 1871, where it was founded by Union generals who were pretty unhappy with the marksmanship levels of their recruits during the Civil War. So, side note, there's actually this pretty famous quote from General Ambrose Burnside, he of the original Sideburn, which says that something like, of every soldier who was perfectly drilled, 1 in 10 actually knew what the gun's sights did and could hit the broadside of a barn. But I couldn't actually confirm that he said this. People just say that he said this, so I'm going to say big if true. From there, in the 1870s and the early 1900s, it's important to say the NRA isn't doing a ton of explicitly political work. It's mostly like shooting competitions and stuff. When Congress passes the very first piece of gun control legislation in 1934, the NRA backs it. Kinda mostly. The NRA actually gets Congress to back off on restrictions to handguns, but backs restrictions on machine guns and sawed-off shotguns, both popular with the post-prohibition gangsters of the era. It was a time. Now, through the early 1900s and all the way after World War II, the NRA is still dominated by these hunters and sports shooter types. Because of that, the NRA continues to reluctantly agree to more gun limitations in 1938 and 1968. That's when Congress passes the Gun Control Act of 1968. But how did the NRA go from reluctantly supporting those bills to
"From my cold, dead hands"?
To answer that question, I actually want to take a look at that 1968 law, because in that moment, I think we see a lot of the same debates reflected from the last 30 years. So the 1960s were something of a crystallizing moment for American gun culture. The gun in American mythology and Americana had always been sort of a symbol, the gun-toting Western, what have you. But in the 1960s, there was a new wave of political violence, and specifically political violence committed with guns. Obviously, the big one is the assassination of JFK in 1963. But the thing to know here is that his assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, actually used a gun that he got through the mail. He got it through a magazine called The American Rifleman, which was published by, you guessed it, the NRA. But even after JFK's assassination, there wasn't the appetite in Congress to ban mail-order guns yet. It actually wasn't until 1968, right? The Gun Control Act of 1968, which happened to follow both the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. Still, even with all this upheaval and political violence and assassinations, Congress doesn't go all the way on the Gun Control Act. In particular, advocates had been pushing for a national gun registry and federal licensing for gun owners, and neither of those made it into the bill, even though they were both supported by Bobby Kennedy before his assassination. In the end, the Gun Control Act banned interstate firearm shipments. It also banned sales to minors, drug addicts, felons, and, I'm going to use the language of the bill here, mental incompetence. But to quote Time magazine when this thing actually passed, quote, "It may take another act of horror to push really effective gun curbs through Congress." I wish I had that much faith in Congress. But this political moment becomes a splinter for the NRA heading into the 1970s. That's when the organization really devolves into a split between the sports shooters and the hunters and the Second Amendment diehards. By 1977, the NRA's national convention devolves into something called the Cincinnati Revolution, or the Cincinnati Coup, or the Cincinnati Revolt, depending on who you're talking to. In any case, the NRA is now firmly in the control of the Second Amendment evangelists, and it's at this point that the NRA becomes the gun lobby as we understand it today. Into the 1980s, the organization starts becoming much more politically active on the American right, going so far as to endorse a president for the first time in Ronald Reagan. By the 1990s, the group tries and fails to stop what's the most expansive gun control legislation since the 60s in the Brady Bill, which was named after Reagan's press secretary. He was actually wounded during an assassination attempt on Reagan and left permanently disabled. That bill, the Brady Bill, created the mandatory back checks and 5-day waiting period we know today. Separately, the Clinton administration also passed the 1994 assault weapons ban. But even as the NRA fails to stop those bills, it's still working to expand its influence in Congress in Washington, D.C. By the time George W. Bush is elected in 2000, it's one of the most powerful lobbying organizations in the country. Just for context, since 1998, the NRA spent more than $70 million lobbying Congress, according to Open Secrets. And under Bush, the NRA was able to get the assault weapons ban to successfully expire in 2004 and effectively curb all gun control legislation during that time period. But it's during this time period, in the 2000s and the early 2010s, that we start to see an acceleration of mass shootings, including school shootings. More than that, researchers have found a pronounced link between mass shootings after 2011 and a spike in gun sales. So, a study from the National Institutes of Health crunched 20 years of gun sale data from California because they released a whole tranche of data in 2016. What they found was that there was very little relationship between gun sales and shootings before 2011. But after 2011, it was not only when California decided to implement gun control legislation that sales spiked, it was after every mass shooting too. And it's that, right there. The death and destruction of gun violence in America, and the dollars and cents that stand to be made by these companies when it happens, that's driven the gun lobby since the 1970s. But don't take it from me, take it from them. Rolling Stone magazine asked Neil Knox, he was the NRA's top lobbyist at the time and one of the architects of the group's rightward shift, whether or not gun control was the best thing to happen to the NRA. I'll quote him directly, no question about it. Anyone who's from Vegas or who's lived here since 2017 knows that this issue is a personal one. I probably don't have to tell you about the Route 91 Harvest Festival shooting on October 1st, 2017, when a gunman used a bump stock and semi-automatic weapons to open fire on a music festival where he killed 60 people and wounded over 400 more. In the years since, policymakers both here in Nevada and in Washington, D.C. have tried to take steps, even baby steps, toward making sure that this kind of violence can't happen again. But whether or not those policies actually end up sticking around and are enforceable in the years after they happen are a testament to the staying power of the gun lobby. And that's even after the NRA has been hobbled by a huge fraud and embezzlement scandal from the last few years. So for instance, after the Route 91 shooting, the Trump administration's Department of Justice decides to ban bump stocks in 2018. But in 2024, a Supreme Court stacked with conservative justices, half of whom came from Trump himself, overturns that ban because, they say, there's no legislative basis for the ban in the first place. On that note, that argument is kind of rich because Representative Dina Titus, a congresswoman from Nevada, has been trying to force a vote on a ban on bump stocks since 2017, but it hasn't gone anywhere, not even after that 2024 Supreme Court ruling. Okay, so what about stuff with a legislative basis? Well, it turns out it's really hard to account for a Supreme Court that's really committed to the NRA's central thesis that what if gun control legislation is bad? Such was the case in 2022 when the Supreme Court actually decided that any gun control legislation without a historical basis was unconstitutional. And that's great because I think the founders were definitely considering 3D printed guns when they wrote it. I think that was on their mind. Yeah. And here's the thing, that Supreme Court case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, has already created something of a chilling effect on what states think they can and can't do when it comes to gun legislation. In Nevada, for instance, lawmakers in 2023 passed a trio of bills that would have banned guns from polling places, that would have prevented anyone convicted of a hate crime from owning a gun, and banned sales of certain semi-automatic weapons to anyone under 21. But Nevada's Republican governor, Joe Lombardo, vetoed all three of those bills, in large part, he said at the time, because he wasn't sure that they would pass the constitutional muster laid down by New York v. Bruin. But the maddening thing here is we don't actually know if that's true or not, because it seems like the Supreme Court is making it up as they go. Just look at last year, when the Supreme Court decided not to upend the Violence Against Women Act and keep a restriction on domestic abusers from accessing guns. Under the plain text of Bruin, it's hard to see why that restriction would still be constitutional. But at the time, Chief Justice John Roberts said that these gun control laws shouldn't be trapped in amber. But if these laws aren't trapped in amber, then one wonders what's the point of the original Brune decision, and if anything is legally consistent, there's even a point to any of this. So that brings us to today, this week, when Nevada lawmakers are bringing back those 3 bills vetoed in 2023, banning guns from polling places, banning the sale of certain firearms to anyone under 21, and prohibiting gun ownership for anyone convicted of a hate crime. But now, everyone in Carson City is left with the hard work. On one side, the legislature, we have a good idea of what's going to happen. These laws passed in 2023, they'll debate them, and we'll see what they do on that side. But on the other side, in the Republican governor's office, it's up to Joe Lombardo to sign or veto those bills, and that is less clear. But that does it for today's episode of the show. If you like what we're doing, like and subscribe so you're the first to know when we upload a new episode. But until next time, this has been Battle Born Bytes. We'll see you next week.